Welcome back to CrimePod Chronicles. I'm Mike.
And I'm Tori. So glad you could join us again, truly.
We're really excited about today's episode because it's a deep dive, I think, into one of those cases that just, it haunts you a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. When we were researching this one, I just kept thinking, how did this remain unsolved? It's just so chilling, and for so long, too.
Right? I mean, we're going way back today to the 1930s for a look at what many consider to be one of America's most, let's say, brutal, unsolved serial killer cases.
Brutal is definitely the word. We're talking about the Cleveland torso murderer, folks. It's a dark journey we're embarking on, one that really set the stage for, a new kind of terror, I guess, in that era.
Yeah, buckle up because we're about to explore the terrifying reign of a killer known by a few different names, but all equally unsettling. It's going to be a wild one.
So, as Mike mentioned, our focus today is on the Cleveland torso murderer. But, this guy had another equally charming moniker, if you can believe it.
Oh, yeah, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Very inviting. And this whole reign of terror, it was primarily active throughout the 1930s, right there in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yep, the Great Depression era. And the reason he earned that delightful nickname, his signature move, if you will, was the dismemberment of his victims. I mean, we're talking about at least 13 known victims, possibly more, whose remains were just found, discarded.
And always in this specific, really impoverished area called Kingsbury Run. It was apparently known for its rougher spots like the Roaring Third or Hobo Jungle. Lots of bars, gambling dens, brothels, the usual haunts for vagrants and people living on the fringes.
Exactly. And that's pretty much who his victims were. They were usually drifters, people whose identities were almost impossible to determine. A lot of them were described as working poor who sadly had nowhere to live but these ramshackle shanty towns, or Hoovervilles as they were called back then.
Yeah, they were easy prey, I guess. People who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearances wouldn't raise immediate alarms. And that, of course, made identifying them, let alone finding their killer, nearly impossible. It's truly grim, and this is where it gets really interesting because a name we all know, or at least recognize from history, gets involved. Eliot Ness. Like the Eliot Ness of the Untouchables fame.
Yeah, I know, right? It's so wild to think about. He was actually Cleveland's public safety director at the time, so he had, authority over the police department, the fire department, all of it. And he basically took it upon himself to, find this guy.
And he certainly took drastic measures. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was known for taking down Al Capone, and now he's facing this completely different, far more elusive type of criminal. He literally, personally conducted raids into these shanty towns. And get this, Tori, he eventually burnt them down.
Yeah, I read that part and I was like, wait, what? He burned down people's homes, essentially? His reasoning, though, he claimed it was to catalog fingerprints, to identify victims more easily, and to get potential victims out of the area, to try and stop the murders.
Right, because like we said, these were drifters, transient people, so no real fixed address, but still, burning down their homes, that's a choice, isn't it? Very controversial.
Absolutely. And 4 days after that, he launched this other, draconian operation where he sent 6 two-man search teams across a huge area, ostensibly to do fire inspections. But, no new information came from that.
Yeah, no, it didn't lead to an arrest or conviction, which is pretty frustrating for him, I imagine. But it did apparently bring to light the, quote, inadequate and unsanitary living conditions in the downtown area. So, accidental social reform, maybe?
Silver lining, I guess, from a really dark cloud. But the killer, he actually taunted Ness. He placed the remains of 2 victims right in full view of Ness's office at City Hall. Can you imagine?
The audacity. And then later, he kept sending Ness postcards. It's like, a personal vendetta, almost. It just shows Ness's intense, almost obsessive determination. This killer clearly got under his skin, and Ness was just determined to catch him, no matter what. And this is where it gets really interesting because a name we all know, or at least recognize from history, gets involved. Eliot Ness, like the Eliot Ness of the Untouchables fame.
Yeah, I know, right? It's so wild to think about. He was actually Cleveland's public safety director at the time. So he had authority over the police department, the fire department, all of it. And he basically took it upon himself to find this guy.
And he certainly took drastic measures. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was known for taking down Al Capone, and now he's facing this completely different, far more elusive type of criminal. He literally personally conducted raids into these shanty towns. And get this, Tori, he eventually burned them down.
Yeah, I read that part and I was like, wait, what? He burned down people's homes, essentially. His reasoning, though, he claimed it was to catalog fingerprints to identify victims more easily and to get potential victims out of the area, to try and stop the murders.
Right, because like we said, these were drifters, transient people, so no real fixed address. But still, burning down their homes, that's a choice, isn't it? Very controversial.
Absolutely. And 4 days after that, he launched this other, draconian operation where he sent 6 two-man search teams across a huge area, ostensibly to do city fire inspections. But, no new information came from that.
Yeah, no, it didn't lead to an arrest or conviction, which is pretty frustrating for him, I imagine. But it did apparently bring to light the inadequate and unsanitary living conditions in the downtown area. So, accidental social reform, maybe?
Silver lining, I guess, from a really dark cloud. But the killer, he actually taunted Ness. He placed the remains of 2 victims right in full view of Ness's office at City Hall. Can you imagine?
Oh, the audacity. And then later, he kept sending Ness postcards. It's like a personal vendetta almost. It just shows Ness's intense, almost obsessive determination, though. This killer clearly got under his skin, and Ness was just determined to catch him no matter what.
So while Ness was, trying to corral the chaos, there were a few victims who actually were identified, which, given the state of the remains and the circumstances, is actually pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it really is, considering how many others remained, John and Jane Does. But 2 of the earliest identified were Edward Andrassy and Florence Polillo.
Edward Andrassy was found first on September 23rd, 1935. His body was found in a gully near Kingsbury Run, and get this, Tori, his head was actually found buried nearby.
Oh, my God. And not just that, right? The details are pretty grim. His body was dismembered, emasculated, only wearing socks. And the autopsy, it showed he was decapitated at the mid-cervical region with even rope burns on his wrists. So, clearly a struggle.
Absolutely. He was 29 and had been dead for a couple days when he was found. He used to be an orderly at a psychiatric hospital, but at the time of his death, he was unemployed, just no visible means of support. Kind of fits that profile, of the working poor or drifters that we talked about earlier.
Right, exactly. And he was identified by his fingerprints, which, thank goodness for that, because otherwise he probably would have just been another unidentified victim in this grim collection.
Yeah. And then a few months later, in January 1936, Florence Polillo was discovered.
Oh, Lawrence, her case is also just as horrific. She was found dismembered, wrapped in paper, packed into half-bushel baskets on East 20th Street, and her head was never found.
Yeah, just gone. Which, meant the coroner couldn't definitively rule her death a homicide, which is just wild to think about. You find a dismembered body packed into baskets and you can't officially say it's a homicide. It just speaks to the sheer brutality and how difficult these cases were to process back then.
It really does. And she was 44 years old, identified by her fingerprints as well, just like Andrassy. It makes you wonder, how many others could have been identified if they had similar records. But the fact that
only a few out of so many were named. It's just so heartbreaking.
It really puts into perspective the lives of these victims who were, for the most part, just forgotten by society.
It really puts into perspective the lives of these victims who were, for the most part, just forgotten by society.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Andrassy and Polillo, who were identified, but the vast majority of the victims, they remained completely anonymous. They were just drifters, John and Jane Does, whose identities were never determined. And that's just wild.
It really is. I mean, the killer's modus operandi, if you can call it that, just made it so difficult too. The torso murderer almost always beheaded or dismembered their victim. Sometimes they even severed the torso in half or removed appendages. And in many cases, the actual cause of death was the decapitation itself.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. And it wasn't just the dismemberment, right? Some of the victims, especially the male victims, were castrated. And then there was this really gruesome detail about chemical treatment.
Oh, yeah. The bodies would be found with this weird, red, tough, almost leathery skin because the killer would apply these chemicals. And, they think he was trying to speed up decomposition or something, but he actually used lime chloride, which had the opposite effect and preserved the bodies, which is just wow.
So he was trying to get rid of the evidence, but actually made them more That's incredibly darkly ironic. And in the 1930s, forensic science was, barely in its infancy. So these factors, plus the heads often being missing, it just compounded the identification problem.
Totally. There was one victim known as the Tattooed Man, John Doe II. He was found in June 1936, just his torso, near some railroad tracks. But then his head was found later near other tracks, and despite having, get this, 6 distinct tattoos, a bird, a band, names Helen and Paul, a heart, an anchor, a flat with initials WCG, a butterfly, and even a comic character, Jigs, on his ankle, he was never identified.
That's actually insane. You have these incredibly specific identifying marks and still nothing. It really speaks to how transient these individuals were or how disconnected they were from anyone who would report them missing.
Right. And then you had others like John Doe I, found near Andrassy, who appeared to have been saturated with oil and set on fire post-mortem. Or Jane Doe I, found in Lake Erie, where her limbs and head were never recovered, likely due to buoyancy. It's just a different horror for each one. 10 unidentified victims in total, 6 John Does and 4 Jane Does. Just numbers, no names for so long.
But, there is a glimmer of hope, though. In 2024, so very recently, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office actually partnered with the DNA Doe Project. They've started exhuming some of these unidentified victims to use investigative genetic genealogy to finally try and give them their names back.
That is incredible. It's a very modern approach to a very old, cold case. After all this time, the idea that some of these forgotten individuals might finally be identified, it's very poignant, isn't it? Their stories could finally be complete.
It is. It's incredibly poignant. And while we've been talking about these, the official 12 victims, the truth is the actual number of victims attributed to the Cleveland torso murderer could be much, much higher.
Yeah, some researchers think it could be 20 or more even. And there are a couple of really strong candidates for additional victims that weren't officially counted.
Right, the Lady of the Lake, for instance. She was found way back on September 5th, 1934. So even before the official start of the murder spree, it was just the lower half of a woman's torso with thighs still attached but amputated at the knees, washed up on Lake Erie.
And her head was never found, of course. She also had an abdominal scar, from a hysterectomy, which made her even harder to identify. And get this, she was found in virtually the same spot as Jane Doe I, another unidentified victim.
And both of them, the Lady of the Lake and Jane Doe I, had this chemical, lime chloride, on their skin, which is just wild. It was supposed to speed up decomposition, but instead it preserved the bodies. So a killer trying to erase evidence actually made it last longer. Just, classic, ironic serial killer incompetence.
Seriously. Then there's Robert Robertson. He was found much later in July 1950, which is well after the official murders ended. He was also decapitated in a way that perfectly fit the profile of the other victims. He was estranged from his family, an alcoholic, kind of on the fringes of society, but police, for some reason, treated his death as an isolated incident, even though newspapers were totally linking it to the torso murderer.
So it's like the official count is 12, but there's a strong possibility that this guy or guys were active for a much longer period. And not just in Cleveland either. This is where it gets really unnerving.
Yeah, because one of the lead investigators, Peter Megrelo, believed the torso murderer's reach extended far beyond Cleveland. He had this theory about what he called the murder swamp killings near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
That's charming. Murder swamp killings sounds like a delightful vacation spot.
Oh, absolutely. Between 1921 and 1942, 9 people, 8 of them unidentified, were found dismembered in swamps or around train yards in Pittsburgh. And the similarities to the Cleveland victims were almost identical.
And here's the kicker. Cleveland and Pittsburgh were directly connected by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line, which, if you think about the victims often being drifters, it makes sense that the killer might have been a transient or at least used the rail lines to transport victims or dispose of bodies in different states.
Exactly. Megrelo was so convinced of this that he actually went undercover as a hobo riding the rails to investigate his theory. He believed the killer was a transient. And, when you look at the evidence, the similar mutilations, the proximity to rail lines, it definitely paints a picture of a much wider, terrifying scope than just Cleveland.
So, with all these horrific details, the expanding scope, who were the police actually looking at? There were only 2 main suspects throughout this entire lengthy investigation, which is kind of wild, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And the first one, the one that really caught their attention, was Frank Dolezal. He was a 52-year-old Cleveland resident.
Right, Frank Dolezal. He was arrested on August 24th, 1939, as a suspect in Florence Palilla's murder. And get this, he actually lived with her at one point.
Yeah, not only that, but he also had connections to Edward Andress and possibly Rose Wallace as well. So, the police definitely had reason to look at him, he was right there.
He was right there, but his story ends pretty tragically and suspiciously. He died in the Cuyahoga County Jail while in police custody, and the circumstances surrounding his death were murky, to say the least.
Yeah, very murky. He supposedly confessed, but then recanted. And then, he's found dead in jail. And later, he was actually posthumously exonerated of any involvement in the torso slings.
So he was cleared, but only after his death and after this whole suspicious incident in jail. It just adds another layer to this case, doesn't it? Even when they had a suspect, there was no real satisfying conclusion, just more questions.
Absolutely. It just goes to show how, frustratingly unsolved this whole thing was. The answers were always just out of reach.
Oh, absolutely. And in this case, it was a pretty prominent figure, at least in Ness's mind, Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney.
Ah, Dr. Sweeney, the name that I think most people associate with this case, even if it's, still technically unsolved. Exactly. Sweeney was a World War I veteran, which is, interesting given the nature of the dismemberments. He was actually part of a medical unit that performed amputations in the field.
Wow. So he had a professional background in surgical procedures, for lack of a better term. That's pretty chilling given what was happening to the victims.
Yeah, it really is. And get this, he even suffered nerve damage from a gas attack during the war. After the war, he became apparently a pretty severe alcoholic due to, pathological anxiety and depression from his wartime experiences.
So, a troubled individual, to say the least. And Ness was personally convinced this guy was the killer?
Oh, absolutely. Ness had like a laser focus on Sweeney. He even personally interviewed him. But first, Ness actually had Sweeney held in a hotel room for 3 days just to sober up before he could even interrogate him. Can you imagine?
Failed the polygraph test, so for Ness, that must have been pretty strong evidence, right? Like, okay, this is our guy.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Ness apparently felt there was a little chance of obtaining a successful prosecution. And you want to know why?
Why? Don't tell me it's another political connection.
Oh, it's always a political connection, Mike. Sweeney was the first cousin of Ness's political opponents, U.S. Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, who had been publicly hounding Ness about his failure to catch the killer.
Unbelievable. So even with a suspect and failed polygraphs, it's just tangled up in political infighting. No wonder this case became so frustrating for everyone involved.
Exactly. And it just gets wilder. After Sweeney committed himself to an institution, the police couldn't really connect him to any more leads. But from his confinement, Sweeney actually sent threatening postcards to Ness and his family, harassing them all the way into the 1950s.
That's creepy. Really, really creepy. Like, the killer was taunting Ness through these postcards, even from an institution. It's almost like a supervillain story, without the resolution.
Pretty much. The postcards only stopped arriving after Sweeney's death in 1964. But despite Ness's strong personal conviction and all these, eyebrow-raising details, the evidence against Sweeney was purely circumstantial. They never had that definitive smoking gun. So what about other theories? Like, could it have been more than one killer? Or were there, other possibilities floating around?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, let's address the elephant in the room that often comes up with these big, sensational, unsolved cases. The connection to other infamous murders.
Oh, no. Don't tell me. The Black Dahlia?
Ding, ding, ding. You got it. So get this. In December 1938, the torso murderer allegedly sent a letter to Ness.
Allegedly sent a letter. Already suspicious.
Right? And in it, the killer claimed to have moved to California, killed a woman there, and buried her head in Los Angeles. The letter, get this, even referred to the killer as DC, or Doctor of Chiropractic.
Oh, come on. That sounds almost too convenient given Sweeney's background.
Exactly. And, this confession made authorities consider a possible link to the Black Dahlia case. Both victims were cleaned after death. A butcher knife was believed to be used in both cases.
But wait, the Black Dahlia murder, Elizabeth Short, was in 1947, right? The letter was sent in 1938. That's almost a decade later.
Precisely. And Short wasn't decapitated, which was a signature for the Cleveland victims. So really, despite the tantalizing connections, it was pretty much circumstantial evidence and sheer speculation. Nothing actually tied Short to the torso murderer.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. It's like people want to connect these big unsolved cases, but sometimes it's just a coincidence or, someone trying to take credit.
Totally. And another theory that came out in 1997 actually suggested that there might not have been a single torso murderer, that the killings could have been committed by different people.
That's interesting. I mean, the dismemberment was consistent, but if the killer was like a transient, as Murillo believed, it's possible multiple individuals could have adopted a similar gruesome method.
Yeah, Peter Murillo, the lead detective, actually believed the torso murderer could have been a transient riding the rails because most of the murders occurred near railroad tracks. He even went undercover as a hobo to investigate that idea.
Wow, that's dedication. So a lot of theories, no definitive answers. It's no wonder this case has just permeated popular culture so much.
Oh, absolutely. The enduring fascination is huge. I mean, there's a 2018 film called The Kingsbury Run based on a modern copycat.
A copycat? That's, disturbing.
Right? And it's been featured in Unsolved Mysteries, which is like a staple for true crime buffs. There's an award-winning graphic novel called Torso by Brian Michael Bendis, which focuses on Eliot Ness's hunt for the killer.
I've actually heard of that one. It sounds like
it's just perfect for that kind of like dark, gritty graphic novel treatment.
Exactly. And there are several fictionalized books like John Peyton Cook's novel Torsos, Amy Harmon's The Unknown Beloved, and Daniel Stashower's Amican Demon, which also details Ness's investigation.
So from graphic novels to historical fiction, it really captures the imagination. I guess the fact that it's still unsolved just adds to the mystique, doesn't it?
It really does. It's the ultimate true crime puzzle, one that, despite all the efforts, still has pieces missing.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating, isn't it? The Cleveland torso murderer really stands out in true crime history precisely because it's unsolved. I mean, despite Ness's involvement, all the resources, the sheer brutality of it all, we still don't know who did it or why.
And that lack of closure, I think, is what makes it so captivating for so many people. It's like, a story without a final chapter.
And the victims, too, so many of them remain unidentified even to this day. Though, hopefully, the DNA Doe Project can change that.
Absolutely. It's a sobering thought, really. These were real people with lives, even if they were on the fringes of society during the Depression. And their stories just ended in such a horrific, unresolved way.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive into a truly dark corner of history. Thank you for walking us through the chilling details of the Cleveland torso murders.
My pleasure, Tori. It's a case that definitely leaves you thinking,
For sure. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of CrimePod Chronicles. We really appreciate you tuning in.
And if you found this case as unsettling as we did, be sure to share the episode with fellow true crime enthusiasts. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss our next deep dive.
We will be back next time with another captivating and possibly equally unsettling case for you to ponder. Until then, stay safe and keep an eye out.
Bye for now.